If you'd like to ask a question, post it in the chat, or they'll have some time at the end where you can ask a question using your voice if you would like. A reminder that this is being recorded, so please just be aware that if you'd like to be hidden, you are recorded. So there is closed captions available, and if that's something that you're interested in, there's some little dots in the toolbar that can make those work. So please turn off your video. That just helps keep the bandwidth appropriate and keep your microphone muted, and there'll be some time at the end to join in. So moving on. Okay. Gabby, can we have the next slide? Okay, so this is the RMIT Cyber Series. We have a variety of different research activities going on at RMIT, and we invite a variety of interesting research industry guests to support this research. Today, could we just have microphones muted, please? Today we have a speaker who is a researcher working in industry, so that is something that we at RMIT really love. We've got Noushin Shabab, who is going to speak about some of her research. The RMIT Cyber Series, we have things happening every month. There'll be something, and some of them are technology focused, some of them are industry focused, some of them are business focused. Next slide, please. We acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of RMIT University and the lands I am speaking from today. We gather virtually across many different parts of the world, so we encourage you to personally acknowledge the lands on which you are joining us from. We acknowledge the First Nations people of the Kulin Nations, their ancestors and elders past, present and emerging, and we acknowledge that these lands are places of teaching, places of learning and places of sharing and knowledge, so we continue that tradition today. The RMIT Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation has 3 different focuses, because we acknowledge that cybersecurity is not a narrow focused area. There is the technology, there is people, and there is organisations, and we need to be working on all 3 angles in order to make the world a safer place. So we develop and promote the understanding of strategies, policies, legal issues, human, organisational and technology aspects, and the cybersecurity innovation ecosystem within Australia and within the world. We are global citizens. We actively encourage collaboration with industry and with government and with academic research. If we all work together, we can make the world a safer place. So I'd like to welcome Noushin Shabab, who is a member of the Global Research and Analytics team at Kaspersky. She is a senior researcher and is specialised in reverse engineering, and her research focuses on investigation of the advanced cybercriminal activities and targeted attacks in the Asia Pacific. So Noushin is an active researcher and speaker at industry events and conferences worldwide. We are very pleased to welcome her to RMIT. Her other keynotes include Interpol, RoxCon, B-Sides, AusCert, the Security Analysis Summit, Women in Cyber Mentoring, which has been organised by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Noushin is an active member of the Australian Women in Cybersecurity Network, which aims to support and inspire women in the Australian security industry. And she is the first mentor to provide technical mentorship for the Australian Women in Cybersecurity Network Female Cadets Program, which aims to bridge the skill gap between what we do in universities and what we need in industry. So welcome, Noushin. Welcome to RMIT, and I'm really looking forward to hear what you've got to say.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Joan, for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me clear.
You're coming through clearly.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so let me share my slides. I hope you see my slides.
Yes, I can see your slides. You're coming through clearly. Yes, thumbs up from everybody. Okay, off you go.
Okay, so the topic for my talk today is threats, trends, and predictions. So I'm going to talk about the major cyber threats and the trends in cyber attacks from this year, from the beginning until now, and hopefully some predictions for next year. I've been introduced by Joanne, but I want to share like a little bit more about my team. I'm part of the global research and analysis team at Kaspersky. We are a distributed team all around the world, about like 40 people, and we investigate cyber attacks from all regions, from Asia Pacific to Europe and America and everywhere in the world. With focus on the most sophisticated attacks, targeted attacks, APT actors, major cybercrime activities, and so on. So for this talk today, I thought, because we are close to the end of the year, I know we still have 2 months to go, but we've been seeing lots of huge attacks with like large scale impacts so far in the year. So I thought it's best to look at these incidents and talk about them a little bit. So let me start with looking at some supply chain attacks. I'm sure that these days supply chain attacks are not new to anyone, but a few years ago, when we investigated supply chain attacks on different cases that impacted huge number of victims, they were not very common. In 2017, we investigated an attack that we called ShadowPad. It was a supply chain attack on a server management software that had customers all around the world, and the attackers managed to backdoor one of their libraries, and this library was packaged in different products of that vendor and was distributed through the official channels of that vendor to their customers. Also, later in 2019, we investigated another major supply chain attack, which we attributed to the same threat actor. This attack was called Shadowhammer, and it involved live update utility of Asus laptops, and impacted huge number of customers of this laptop manufacturer in the world. So let's talk about some more recent ones that I'm sure everyone has heard about them. Let's talk about attack on SolarWinds. It actually started in December 2020. News of SolarWinds incident were all over the news. This newly discovered supply chain attack, which was attributed to Dark Halo, also known as Nobilium threat actor, planted a backdoor in the SolarWinds RMIT software. It is believed that when FireEye discovered the first traces of the campaign, the threat actor had already been working on it for over a year. Evidence gathered so far indicates that Dark Halo spent at least 6 months inside Orion IT's network to perform their attack and make sure that their tampering of the build chain wouldn't cause any adverse effects. The supply chain attack was designed in a very professional way, and the main goal was to stay undetected for longer. For example, before making their first internet connection to their command and control server, the malware that was called Sunburst lie dormant for a long period, in some cases up to 2 weeks, which was done to prevent detection of this behavior in sandboxes, or like easily detection and understanding what's happening by researchers. Through the SolarWinds Orion IT packages, the attackers reached about 18,000 customers. This is according to SolarWinds alert themselves. Yet out of these 18,000, it would appear that only a handful were interesting to them. So how the attackers would go about attacking the interesting cases In the initial phase, the Sunburst malware would talk to the CNC server, command and control server, by sending encoded DNS requests. These requests contain information about the infected computer. And if the attackers would see this customer interesting enough, the DNS response would include a CNAME record pointing to a second level CNC server, which these second level CNC servers allowed researchers to find out more about the actual targets of the attack. But talking about the SolarWinds incident, it didn't end in December 2020. There were lots of updates throughout the year of 2021. First of all, it was in January 2021, researchers have identified new malwares used in the SolarWinds attacks. The first malware they found, they named it Sunspot. It was deployed in September 2019 when the attackers first breached the company's network. As you remember, I said it was a long-term investigation by the threat actor inside the network of the target. So it was installed on SolarWinds build server, and it was designed to monitor the server for commands that assembled the Orion product. And once the build command was detected, the malware silently replaced the source code of the files with the files that loaded the Sunburst malware. This technique we had seen in previous supply chain attacks in previous years as well, when the attackers would carefully wait for the specific software target on the software development environment, and when that target software was being compiled, they would replace some parts of the source code or add some malicious code to the source code, resulting in building a backdoored and Trojanized software. There was another malware that was found in January as well, related to this attack. The researchers called this malware Raindrop. It was a backdoor loader that would drop a Cobalt Strike module, which was used for post-compromise and as a means of moving laterally across the target network. So while looking at the Sunburst backdoor, we actually discovered several features that overlap the previously identified backdoor known as Coswar. Coswar was a .NET backdoor that was first reported by Palo Alto network researchers in 2017. Palo Alto tentatively linked Coswar to the Turla APT group. It is a Russian-speaking threat actor, but there was no solid attribution link being public. So later in February, three fresh vulnerabilities have been found in SolarWinds products. The first two have been found in the Orion user device tracker, and the other one in the FTP for Windows products, which the most severe of these vulnerabilities could allow remote code execution with high privileges, but they have not been seen in the wild and probably not related to the SolarWinds incident. Also, a second APT actor independently exploited a separate vulnerability in SolarWinds products last year, but it was found again in February this year. And this threat actor was targeting the US Department of Agriculture's National Finance Center. This was not a supply chain attack. The attackers actually exploited a vulnerability in the software after it had been deployed to the target's network. And they installed a backdoor called Supernova. Again, this activity was unrelated to the Sunburst attack that Trojanized the SolarWinds Orion updates. So further updates, in March 2021, researchers have identified new malware families that were being used by the same threat actor behind SolarWinds attacks. They include a backdoor called GoldMax or Sun Shuttle, and also a few other malwares. Finally, in June, earlier in June, our internal systems found traces of a successful DNS hijacking affecting several government zones of a CIS member state. These incidents occurred during short periods in December 2020 and January 2021, around the same time as the first news about SolarWinds came out. This DNS hijacking allowed malicious threat actors to redirect traffic from a government mail server to machines the attackers controlled. We call this malware Tomiris. And while analyzing this malware, we noticed a number of similarities with the Sun Shuttle malware that was found earlier related to SolarWinds incident. The similarities were different in different areas. For example, the language that the malwares were written in, the type of packers and protections that they used for the code, different similarities in the structure of the configuration block of the malwares, similar obfuscation routines, encryption routines, and so on. Of course, many of these similarities are not very heavy link that can give us confidence that these malwares are related, but there were also other stuff, like we found the malwares like this malware Tomiris and Sun Shuttle in similar systems in like same network for a victim and so on. So we believe that they are connected. So this is the story of SolarWinds so far. I'm sure there will be more news and updates about this huge attack. Let's talk about other supply chain attacks. I guess 2021 was full of supply chain attacks. It was the year of supply chain attacks with huge impacts. Next one, it was on January 11th that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand reported a data breach in result of the compromise of a third-party file sharing service, which was shortly identified as Accelion. The compromise of the Accelion file transfer appliance file sharing service impacted nearly 100 clients of the company and was enabled primarily by 4 zero-day vulnerabilities. A few days later, on January 22nd, Financial Review reported about the Australian law firm Allen data breach due to the same Accelion's compromise. Also, a few days later, on January 2015, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission stated that in December 2020, due to a vulnerability to the file transfer appliance provided by Accelion, which was previously used by them, an unidentified threat actor accessed the server containing attachments to Australian credit license applications submitted to them for a period of 6 months. Also, in the following months, other impacted parties, mostly from the USA, Canada, and also Singapore, reported about their cases that were related to the Accelion supply chain attack. Moving on, these were not the only supply chain attacks that we saw in 2021. There were other ones as well. Like, for example, this one from CodeCov. CodeCov is a code analysis tool with which users can group, merge, archive, and compare coverage reports. This is actually used by software developers. They can change the coverage of their, they can check the coverage of their codes through the unit test and see which lines of the codes were executed, which were not. So on April 15th, CodeCov publicly disclosed that its bash uploader script has been compromised and was distributed to users between the end of January and the beginning of April. The bash uploader script is publicly distributed by CodeCov and aims to gather information on the user's execution environments, collect code coverage reports, and also send them to the CodeCov infrastructure. So with the supply chain attacks, the the first victim in any attack is the software developer, vendor, or the software developer system itself. So it makes sense for the attackers to collect information about the software developer's environments. Another example, it was from earlier in the year. ESET discovered a new supply chain attack compromising the update mechanism of Nox Player. It's an Android emulator for PCs and Macs, and it's part of big Nox product range with over 150 million users worldwide. Based on an update report from ESET in June this year, the APT threat actor that was responsible for that attack is called Gelsemium, if I'm pronouncing correctly, and it was also found responsible for other recent supply chain attacks against targets in China, Japan, Mongolia, Taiwan, North Korea, South Korea, and also various Middle Eastern countries. And the target profiles include governments, religious organizations, electronics manufacturers, and universities. Apart from these examples, throughout the year, our researchers discovered further unrelated supply chain attacks with more narrow target profiles, such as like a few examples. There was the Myanmar Presidential Office website that was targeted in a supply chain attack. The threat actor actually injected malware inside a localized Myanmar phone package that was available for download on the site's front page. There was also another example of a Chinese-speaking APT actor modifying a fingerprint scanner software installed that was on a distribution server in India. So moving on, I actually saw a question. I can take questions before each part, or should I leave them for the end?
You can answer the question now. So what are the goals of the adversary attacking the SolarWinds system? Do you know?
So in these cases, as I explained earlier, the compromised systems were in a larger scale, like huge number, but the actual targets were not this huge number. Like, for example, with other cases, like previous cases from previous years, we realized that the attackers go after very specific targets, but I mean they mass compromise the victims, but they are actually after specific targets. And with these specific targets, they may actually go further to do another supply chain attack, like with the case of Asus that we analyzed 2 years ago. We discovered that the first foothold that the attackers got into the Asus network was through another supply chain attack, which happened like in the previous year. So the attackers used another backdoor software to get into the Asus network, and from there they compromised their software to get into other systems. So it's not clear the main goal, but it is clear that they are after very specific targets, and they know details that are not known to everyone about that targets, and it means that they have been investigating those targets. Like, for example, in some cases, they know the actual MAC address of the systems that they want to target. So they are very specific, and they are very sophisticated in how they collect information about that target. With this level of sophistication, it's not easy to understand their actual intention and what actual information they were after. But most likely, these are all cyber espionage attacks, and they are all after. They are not after stealing money or something. They are after stealing information or intellectual property and so on. I hope that answered a little bit.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. This one's actually from me. You mentioned that 2021 has been a big year for supply chain attacks. Is that a trend that you've seen increasing over the past few years, or does this year sort of stand out?
Yes, we did actually see the increase. As I said, in 2017, we analyzed the one of the biggest supply chain attacks of that time. Supply chain attacks were not very common back then, although our research showed that many years ago, like even in 1960s and 1970s, there were concerns of compromised development environments or backdoor softwares in big organizations that were doing highly sophisticated operations. But yeah, the supply chain attacks were not that common. But throughout the years, since 2017 until now, we've been seeing larger scale attacks like the Asus case, and this one with the SolarWinds, also the Accelion case, and the little ones. So yeah, definitely a trend.
Thank you.
Is there another question?
There's a question here, but it's coming up as blank on my screen. So Malka, do you have a question? Maybe you could retype it. It's just coming as a blank box for me.
Oh, it's in black.
Oh, it's in black text. Oh, okay, right.
So have you noticed any supply chain attacks?
Yeah, in companies that use blockchain-based supply chain.
That's a good question. I don't have anything on top of my mind, but if I find more, I can share later. You can reach me out, send me an email, or send me a message on LinkedIn, on Twitter, wherever you are. If I find something, I'll definitely share with you. But sorry, don't have anything right now.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Okay, let's move on. The next trend I want to talk about is the zero-day vulnerabilities. I'm sure everyone is familiar with zero-day vulnerabilities, and they've been used in sophisticated attacks for a long time with different threat actors. Doesn't matter how, if they are super sophisticated or they are just as sophisticated enough as they can afford buying a zero-day or developing an exploit for a zero-day. We've seen zero-day attacks from different threat actors. But let's talk about some of the zero-day attacks from this year. First of all, this one was quite again hot news. It was in March this year. Microsoft released an out-of-band patch for 4 vulnerabilities that you see on the screen. These vulnerabilities affected Microsoft Exchange servers. They have been observed by multiple zero-day exploits in the wild. Microsoft actually attributed the attacks to a threat actor called Hafnium, which is believed to be an APT actor linked to China. However, other researchers believe that other groups have also used these vulnerabilities to launch attacks. So in these cases, the cases that Microsoft investigated, the attackers have been able to access email accounts, steal data, and install malware on target machines for long-term remote access. In the US, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency issued an emergency warning that the vulnerabilities were being actively exploited. And also, this is according to Wikipedia, as of 9th of March, like 1 week after the disclosure of the vulnerabilities, it was estimated that 250,000 servers fell victim to the attacks, including servers belonging to around 30,000 organizations in the United States, 7,000 servers in the United Kingdom, as well as the European Banking Authority, the Norwegian Parliament, and the Chile's Commission for the Financial Market as well. So this was one of the main ones. Other ones that I want to talk about, first of all, some zero-day vulnerabilities from Google that were exploited in the wild. It was on May 19th that Google updated its Android security bulletin to report that there were indications that 4 vulnerabilities may be under limited targeted exploitation. The 4 vulnerabilities that you see in that blue part in the slide. The first two, CB 2021-1905 and CB 2021-1906, were related to Qualcomm GPU. The first one was a use after free bug, while the second one was patched at the same time and is believed to be related to an older patch vulnerability. Also, there were 2 other ones, CB 2021-2863 and CB 2021-28664, which are related to the ARM GPU kernel driver. The first one would allow privilege escalation or information disclosure because of GPU memory operations might be mishandled, and it can lead to a use after free vulnerability. The second one would allow privilege escalation or a denial of service because of a memory corruption and because an unprivileged user can achieve read and write access to read-only pages. So the second one that you see on the screen, on June this year, Google warned of a vulnerability in its Chrome web browser. The CV number assigned to it is CV 2021-30-551, and it's actively under attack, was actively under attack. Maybe it still is. So the exploit is a type confusion bug within Google's V8 open source JavaScript and WebAssembly engine. So let's talk about some zero-day vulnerabilities from Apple that were exploited in the wild. First one, it was in January, 26th of January, Apple patched 3 0 days for iOS 14.04 and iPad OS 14.04. The first one was found in the OS kernel, and the 2 other ones were discovered in the WebKit browser engine. And Apple believed that all 3 have been exploited in the wild. Later, on June 14th, Apple issued another out-of-band security fix for 2 zero-day vulnerabilities affecting the Safari web browser. Apple believed that they may have been actively exploited. The vulnerabilities which affect 6th generation Apple iPhones, iPads, and iPod Touch devices that were released between 2013 and 2018. So another one, in July, Apple patched another zero-day vulnerability that would allow an attacker to take over an exploited system. The vulnerability was a memory corruption flaw and was found in an extension which existed in both iOS and macOS. Apple released 3 updates to patch this vulnerability on each of these platforms. Apple was aware of a report that the vulnerability was being actively exploited in the wild. Moving on, other zero-day vulnerabilities exploited in the wild. It was in May this year, Jaren Bradley, the macOS researcher, published a blog post about a zero-day vulnerability that would let an attacker bypass Apple's transparency, consent, and control, and that was being exploited in the wild. The vulnerability that was given the number CV 2021-3713 can be abused by a malicious application to secretly take screenshots, use the camera and microphone to record and access files on Mac machines. The vulnerability has been exploited by a malware family that's called XSS set. So the other one, this one was also quite interesting. Sentinel-1 Labs researchers investigated 5 severe vulnerabilities that have been discovered in Dell's firmware update driver, and they were potentially impacted hundreds of millions of Dell desktops, laptops, notebooks, and tablets. The vulnerability have been remained undisclosed for 12 years and could allow the ability to bypass security products and to execute code to pivot to other parts of the network for lateral movement. So this was these multiple vulnerabilities were local privilege escalation vulnerabilities that existed in the firmware update driver, which was in use since 2009. So the driver component that would handle the Dell firmware update via the Dell BIOS utility was vulnerable, but there was no indication that it was exploited in the wild. Next one, this one was also quite interesting. It was in April this year that NSA, CISA, and FBI jointly published an advisory stating that APT29 was conducting widespread scanning and exploitation of vulnerable systems that included PulseSecure. PulseSecure, later in May, delivered an out-of-cycle update and workaround package for providing a solution for multiple vulnerabilities. In particular, the vulnerability was in Connect Secure VPN devices, and it had been exploited by nation-state actors to launch cyber attacks against US defense, finance and government targets, as well as victims in Europe. The company also patched 3 other vulnerabilities, 2 of which were also critical remote code execution vulnerabilities. The intrusions involving the compromise of PulseSecure VPN appliances include different organizations, as I said, in defense, in government, also in high tech, in transportation, in financial sector, and in different parts of the world. We are also aware that after exploitation, the threat actor proceeded to deploy a simple web shell to maintain persistence on the victim system. Sorry. Okay, so before I move to the next part, is there any question about the vulnerabilities?
We have a question. Should we change to a new phone or device when it's no longer receiving security patches?
If it's no longer receiving security patches, I would say yes, definitely. But there have been cases that the vulnerability was so, the attack was so widespread that the vendors actually released patch for out of support cases as well. Like, for example, you all remember the case of WannaCry, where Microsoft actually released a patch for older versions of Windows that were not receiving security patches anymore. But yeah, I would say definitely. I always tell people to update their systems to the latest release, and if there is a device, if it's a phone, a laptop, whatever device it is, it's a smart device at home that doesn't receive a security patch, or sometimes doesn't even have a means to receive a security update, doesn't make much sense to use it.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay, now let's talk about some sophisticated ransom attacks. First of all, Channel 9 ransomware incident. I'm sure everyone remembers that. It was in March. 9 News published that the 9 network was at the center of the largest cyber attack on a media company in Australia's history, which had brought network's news production systems around the country to a halt for more than 24 hours. They said that the digital production systems had been offline for a period of time, and they've been describing, they had described the attack as a sophisticated and calculated attack, and that has fundamentally disrupted how the network delivers and presents news. 9 News said that the attack was affecting the network's ability to produce news, and forcing them to take some time to fix it. So according to The Guardian, Australia's cybersecurity agency was able to alert 2 other organizations that were targeted by the same ransomware attackers who crippled 9 Entertainment News after they have investigated the attack. I guess we don't have much time. I have to make it a little bit faster. Another example of a ransomware attack that had high impact was a ransomware attack that halted the operations of Colonial Pipeline Co. in the US. It was in May this year. The Colonial Pipeline Co. supplies the east coast of the US with 45% of its liquid fuels. The company took some of its systems offline, causing fuel supply delays and also leading to a 4% rise in gasoline use. The company reportedly paid 75 bitcoins, around $5 million, to restore its data. Later in June, in a joint press release, the US Department of Justice and FBI announced that it had recovered around 2.3 million euros of the ransom allegedly paid to this ransomware actor that's called DarkSide by Colonial Pipeline. They were able to track multiple transfers of Bitcoin and identify that approximately 63 Bitcoins were paid as a result of this ransomware case. So moving on, there was an interesting case of attack, cyber attack this year that I wanted to mention. There was this threat actor that was targeting security researchers since the beginning of the year. It was in January this year that the hackers with links to North Korea used fake profiles on social networks such as Twitter, LinkedIn, Telegram, Discord, Keybase, also email. They used them to approach security researchers. They have been made contacts, and the threat actors asked the researchers if they wanted to collaborate on a vulnerability research, and then if they would agree, the attackers would share a Visual Studio project with them. This project would contain a malicious code that would install a backdoor on the researcher's computer. We actually concluded that the malware belonged to Lazarus threat actor. That's one of the most active threat actors in the region and in the world. One interesting thing about Lazarus threat actor is that they operate cyber-espionage as well as financially motivated attacks in the world. One of the only nation-state actors that goes after money as well. So we believe that the attack was done to a cluster of malware from Lazarus Group that we call Threadneedle. Also, the Google Threat Analysis Group announced that a North Korean related threat actor had targeted security researchers. We confirmed that the several infrastructure overlaps were between the attacks they investigated and the one that we investigated from Lazarus Group. What else? We also found another in April. In April, we our research showed that the same threat actor that targeted the security researchers in January, it appeared that they were preparing a new campaign. They were using actually a fake company and associated social media accounts with that fake company to to try to trick security researchers to join this company. So the fake company called Security Elite, something like this. And the purpose of the company was to do offensive security research, and it was made to seem that it was a company located in Turkey. The company actually claimed to offer pen tests, software security assessment, and exploits, and yeah, it was a fake company. Moving on, let's talk about some non-Windows vulnerabilities and attacks. First of all, this was an interesting case of IoT attacks. Researchers have estimated that more than 100 million internet-connected devices were vulnerable to a class of flaws that they named NameRec. The devices affected range from smartphones, aircraft navigation systems, and industrial Internet of Things. They were all vulnerable to either a denial of service attack or remote code execution. There were mainly 9 vulnerabilities that have been identified within the implementation of the DNS protocol in TCP/IP stack. So these vulnerabilities appear to be in the well-known IT software FreeBSD and also in popular IoT firmware such as Siemens Nucleus Net. So this FreeBSD software, it's a Linux operating system, is widely known to be used for high-performance servers in millions of IT networks, including major websites such as Netflix, Yahoo, and so on. So the researchers believe that not all devices running these softwares were vulnerable, but maybe like 1% that would calculate to 100 million devices were impacted by this vulnerability and this attack. Next one. Another vulnerability in the Linux kernel, researchers discovered an information disclosure vulnerability in the Linux kernel, which could be exploited to expose information in the kernel stack memory of vulnerable devices. The vulnerability would allow an attacker to write few bytes of uninitialized stack memory, which could actually bypass KASLR, which is kernel address space layout randomization. That's an actually anti-exploit technique that places like various objects of a code in random places that would prevent predictable patterns that are guessable by attackers. Also, earlier in the year, researchers have found a vulnerability in sudo. Sudo is a utility built into most Unix and Linux operating systems that lets a user without security privileges access and run a program with the credentials of another user. That's what the vulnerability does, not the sudo itself. Okay, that was almost what I wanted to share. Let's talk about some predictions for 2022. As we already discussed, supply chain attacks have been a trend for the past few years, and we believe that we will continue to see more supply chain attacks and more sophisticated ones in the future, in 2022 as well. We had seen targeted ransomwares a lot in the past few years. The ransomwares are not like they were a few years ago. And these days, ransomwares are very targeted. There are specific targets. The attackers are more sophisticated. They steal data before they encrypt it. And if they believe that the victim is not willing to pay the ransom to get their data back, they sometimes threaten to share data online, or they even sometimes do that. They sell data stolen in darknet markets and so on. Also, sophisticated mobile malwares. We have been seeing more and more mobile malwares and sophisticated threat actors going after mobile platforms for the past few years. This makes us believe that there will be more sophisticated mobile malwares, even like attack platforms, coming in the future. Last but not least, malware platforms shared between threat actors. This has also been going on for some time. It makes more sense for attackers to buy or hire another attack an attack platform instead of developing it themselves for many reasons. First of all, it's not everyone has the capabilities and knowledge to find vulnerabilities, to write exploit codes, or even write malware codes that are sophisticated. Second of all, it makes the attribution operation quite difficult because everyone uses similar malwares. It's not easy to understand who was behind an attack and so on. So these are the main predictions. But before we end, I wanted to end the talk with the good news from the cyberspace. It was earlier in the year in a joint operation, law enforcement agencies in Canada, France, Germany, Lithuania, and the Netherlands and Ukraine, and also the UK and the US, have taken down a network of hundreds of botnet servers supporting Emotet. And that's a very common botnet. It was part of the Operation Ladybird. The operation removed active infections on more than 1 million endpoints worldwide. So that was it. I'm ready to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. There's lots of exciting things to think about, and we've got lots of questions here. So
Sure.
Shah says, what is the percentage of cyber attacks that are actually come out in the media, and how many are sort of dealt with in a very kind of private manner and never become public knowledge?
That's a very good question. So we are talking about like major cyber attacks and like targeted attacks, right? Not the normal like malware cases. Because the malware cases, I mean, if a malware is found on someone's systems, of course it remains private between the security software that's present on their system and the victim. But talking about the major cyber attacks, it depends on many factors, like if a researcher, an external researcher, finds out about the attack, or if the victim finds out about the attack themselves. In cases that the victims find out themselves, they start usually using their preferred security research team or their internal security research team to investigate the attack. And then, depending on the on different laws and like culture in the country or in the industry, they may share or may not share that they've had an incident. I mean, in many countries, there is no law that that forces companies to disclose if they've been compromised or if they've had a data breach. In many cases, they remain unpublished, maybe not private, not public, but still there are a lot of public reports that helps others to learn about the attacks and protect themselves, their industry, or their customers from future attacks similar to that.
Okay, thank you. The next one, you mentioned that supply chain attacks have been an increasing trend. What can we do to mitigate against supply chain attacks?
Sure. So actually, the reason that they have been quite common, and the attackers tend to perform this sort of attacks, is that they are much more difficult to prevent. First of all, supply chain is usually a trusted chain. It's a trusted communication, means that people use like companies outsource parts of their operations, and they believe that what they receive is trusted and they don't need to verify the integrity of it that much. But that's one of the main things that can help to mitigate supply chain attacks. Even though businesses use trusted partners, it only makes sense to make sure about the integrity of the service that you receive from them. Like, for example, with one of the cases that I mentioned today, if you remember, there was one supply chain attack that I talked about, code cov. It was the code. It was the software for software developers, like testing their codes. In this case, they actually mentioned that how they realized about the attack was that one of their customers was checking the SHA-SUM, the hash of the file that they would have received if it was not compromised, with the file that they had received and was actually compromised. And when they saw it was mismatched, they notified the vendor, and they realized that there was a compromise and there was this supply chain attack. So that's the main thing that we can do: trust but verify. So I guess yeah, that's the main thing.
That's probably very good advice to end on. Trust but verify. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. It's been a really, really interesting hour learning all about supply chain attacks and different malware attacks. There is more seminars coming up next month. So next month, Gabby, if you have the slide about things coming up. We have the HDR seminar, which a bunch of our PhD students at RMIT will be speaking about some of their research, and we have a panel discussion on phishing next month. There it is. Okay, the Cybersecurity HDR conference, and a panel event on phishing on Friday the 26th of November. So Gabby's in charge of inviting people to them. So thank you, Noushin. It's been really, really spectacular. Thank you to the Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation for hosting this. And thank you to our spectacular audience who asked a lot of interesting questions. And Noushin, thank you for answering all of these interesting questions. So
thank you,
everybody.
John, Gabby, and everyone from RMIT team for having me, and thanks to the audience who joined and actively participated.
And plenty of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.